So what you're going to need, again, is your charcoal, a straight edge, your blending stump, and a pencil with an eraser. So first things first, the first thing we want to do, as always, is title and name. So we're going to write our name at the top. I'm going to write it in the far corner this time. And this is titled the Charcoal Sphere and Value Scale. Charcoal is going to be a little bit on the messy side. So be sure that whatever you have on this side is something that you don't, like, it's okay to get a little messy. Now the first thing we're going to do is the value scale, and I'm going to start by doing my value scale on this side. Okay, now I'm going to kind of take my hands and move it out like about a hand's width away from the edge of my paper, and I'm just going to take my pencil and sketch a straight line. It doesn't have to be exact, but just give me enough kind of space to work with. At the top will be dark, and at the bottom will be light. So at the top we will have our cast shadow, which is our darkest object. And at the bottom we have our highlight or reflected light, which is our lightest part of the object. Now I could just take my charcoal and kind of start shading, but it's going to get everywhere. Charcoal is very messy. So I recommend at this time, if you don't have something already, grab a paper towel or something that'll just kind of be easy for you to wipe your hands on. So be sure to grab something that you can wipe your hands on as we move throughout this project. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my straight edge. You can also use a piece of scrap paper or a piece of tape. And I'm going to just kind of line that up with the edge of my line just to keep everything kind of nice and neat. I don't want my charcoal getting everywhere when I move on to shading my sphere. So I'm just going to kind of use that to block things off for now as I create my value scale. So, everybody ready? Let's go. So we start with our shadow first. Now notice how when I hold it, I'm not holding it like a pencil. I'm kind of pinching it between my thumb and my fingers, and I'm just using the edge to kind of apply the charcoal onto the paper. Just about a hand's width of dark value. These are going to be my shadows. So I'm going to take a finger, and I'm just going to kind of go in this circular motion, pulling the charcoal down into my midtone. So again, taking some of this charcoal from the darker area, moving it down into my midtone, creating a smooth transition of values between my shadows, my midtones, and my highlight. Now, we don't have any like white charcoal. White charcoal does exist, but we're not using it for this project. Instead, to create the highlight, we're just going to let the whiteness of the paper show through. So we're not going to shade in the whole thing. Or if we do shade in the whole thing, we're going to use our eraser to pull up some of that charcoal. So if you notice you've lost this white area, you can always use the eraser to kind of erase and lighten it if you need to. Oop. So create that smooth transition of value. Make sure that you have kind of an even amount of shadows, midtones, and highlights. And then when you're done, you want to go, this is kind of takes projects from like the A level to the A++ level. It's going back over again and darkening those shadows. Think of it like the spell check on an essay. It's just taking things to the next level, making sure there's a lovely contrast between your brightest highlights and your darkest shadows, and a smooth transition in between. There we go. Ta-da! Now, if it does kind of get a little blurry, as mine did, you have a couple options. You can, of course, blow on that extra charcoal. You can also tap it off just to kind of get all those little bits and pieces out of the way. Now your eraser, you can use that just to kind of tidy up the edge a little bit. Keep that edge nice and clean. So you should have that shadow, that value should come all the way to the edge. If you would like to see the rubric for this assignment, it can be found on the Google submission slide. What I am looking for is I'm looking for a smooth transition of values, an even amount of darks, mediums, and lights, and that your project is as neat and clean as possible, barring a couple smudges. So here we have our darkest value is our cast shadow. Our medium is our kind of going into our midtone is our core shadow. Here we have our midtone, the transition between our core shadow and our highlight. And then finally down here we have our background. You always want to start with kind of a bit of a base coat. That way when we erase the highlights back in, they really pop. Okay, now we're going to move on to our background. So there's a couple ways you can do the background. I think the best way, one way you can do it is just to take your charcoal. Be sure that you don't have too much white space between your marks. And you shade in the whole area very lightly. And then you use the palm or heel of your hand in a circular motion. You blend it out. The goal is we're aiming for kind of like a really light gray. It's okay if we go into the words a little bit. You can also use, if you don't want to use your hand and get your charcoal all over your hand, although it is inevitable, you can use the paper towel, fold it into like a neat square, and blend out with that as well. Now, some students are kind of tempted to use the pencil to sketch. It's a kind of a comfort thing where it's just what we're used to using. But it's actually better to sketch with the charcoal for a number of reasons. Number one, the pencil doesn't really blend into the charcoal very well. You'll still see those outlines, and we don't want that. We want the outlines to disappear. Number two, the advantage of sketching with the charcoal is if you make a mistake, you can always just blend it into your background. There we go, all gone. So we're going to start by sketching a circle. A sphere starts off as a circle. So I'm just going to kind of do these little rather than just putting my pencil down and drawing a circle or tracing a circle, I'm going to do these little tiny marks that I can adjust as I go. If there's any part that you don't like, you can again always blend it into the background to make it disappear. Next, I'm going to add a surface for mine to sit on, blending out where they overlap, just like we did with our treehouse project. And then designating my light source. The light, just like we did with our treehouse project, you need to pick a direction for your light. I always pick the upper right. I don't know why, it's just what I like to do. So if the light is coming from the upper right, that means that the cast shadow is going to be below our object. It kind of echoes the shape of the circle, like it's almost like a sphere that's like circle that's been like stretched and pulled out. Okie dokie, so, perfect. So next we're going to do our shadow. I always like to work kind of from the back to the front. So I did the background first, then I like to work dark to light. So I start with my shadow first. Now, so far we've done hatching and cross-hatching in order to create a smooth transition of values. The next thing we want to learn to do is called contour shading, meaning when we shade, the stroke of our mark echoes the shape of our objects. We did this a little bit when we shaded in our trees, or that's how I chose to shade in my trees. So when I shade, I'm going to kind of add this crescent-shaped mark here that echoes my marks kind of echo the shape of the sphere itself. Again, the shadows often kind of reflect the shape of the object. So in this case, a crescent shape for a sphere. Next, just like we did with my value scale, I'm going to blend out the transition between my core shadow and my midtone, being sure to blend the outline into the shadow. You always want to blend the outline into the darker object. Just like we did before, if you notice that it gets a little too light, you can always go back in and add some more over it. but you do want to make sure that you have that smooth transition. Okay, now that we have our core shadow, we have our smooth transition for our mid-tone, we're going to add our highlight. For the highlight, I'm going to use the eraser to draw that highlight back in, making sure that the highlight is lighter than my background. I'm using a clean finger, by the way, to like loosen up these eraser marks, and then tap, 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 off they go. Or you can blow them off, but I would recommend loosening them with a clean finger first. Then using my blending finger, I'm going to soften the transition between my highlight and my midtone. And I have my highlight, my midtone, my core shadow. But I still have this really pronounced highlight. Now what you want to do if you have the highlight, I really have this pronounced outline. You want to blend that outline into the darker object. So what is darker, the highlight or the background? Well, the background should be darker. So I'm going to blend that outline into my background. So kind of blend it in. And if you lose that highlight, so I lost that highlight a little bit, use the eraser and draw it back in. And of course, if you want, you can always darken the background just a little bit around that highlight to really make it pop. I'm going to use my blending stump to make sure that I have a smooth, crisp line in between my highlight and my background. And then blend it out the rest of it with my finger. Okay, so background, outlines blended, highlight, check, midtone, check, core shadow, check. Well, how about this cast shadow? Well, we want to start dark where the object first, dark where it meets the sphere, and then lighter as it goes away. So I use my blending stump for areas that are too big to fit my finger, or if I want smoother, crisper lines. So I use my blending stump to blend my cast shadow. I think a common error I see on still lifes is students just kind of make their cast shadows one block, like black block. But what you really want to do is you want to see some transition of value inside those cast shadows. It should be lighter at the edge and darker where it first meets the object. And the final thing is the reflected light. Light works in a variety of ways. It hits the top of our object to create the highlight. It also bounces off the table and back onto our objects as well. So I want to see a little bit of light, usually around like the edges of round objects, or kind of where things catch. So if you take a look at this, notice how we see kind of that reflected light there along the edge, and here and here. It's the light from the overhead bouncing off of this plastic. You also often will see reflected light kind of catching on the lips of objects as well. Okay, so that's an important place to look for that reflected light, kind of in between your core shadow and your cast shadow, and along the edges and lips of round objects, as well as anywhere anything is shiny. The final step of this is just touch-ups, making sure that your edges are neat and clean, using the eraser to tidy up, or to using the blending stump to crisp up edges. When you have finished your sphere and your value scale. Be sure to take a picture and add it to your Google submission slide.